Joining me today is author Paul Sunseri, psychologist and author of Gentle Parenting Reimagined: How to Make It Work with Oppositional and Defiant Kids. In recent years, gentle parenting has become popular among parents, but it sometimes can be challenging to pull off. With its emphasis on building connections and acknowledging feelings, the parenting philosophy helps children feel supported and valued while giving parents the tools to calmly guide them as they grow and develop. Yet, while this approach seems infinitely better than the authoritarian styles of previous generations, parents often find that it can be challenging to execute with kids that are more strong willed and oppositional. Leading child and family expert Dr. Paul Sunseri reveals there are practical, effective, evidence based solutions that drastically reduce common daily behavior challenges. And those solutions are based on a respectful, loving style that today's parents prefer. He's a clinical psychologist and developer of intensive family focused therapy, which is a highly effective form of family based mental health care. Welcome to the show. Nice to have you on, Paul.
Well, thank you, Kathryn. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Right. This is kind of gentle parenting reimagined, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly this, you're saying that this actually works with kids, so difficult kids who can often be oppositional, defiant kids. Uh, Apparently, and having read your work, there are kind of three general different kinds of parenting: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive. How does this parenting fit into those categories?
Well, gentle parenting probably fits most neatly into the authoritative parenting style, but it does lean permissive. So, permissive parenting is when kids kind of run the show. There isn't a lot of structure, adult authority. So, gentle parenting does have a bit of that in it. But the authoritative style, theoretically, and there's been quite a bit of research on this showing that it's probably the best parenting style that there is. Those kids tend to grow up well because they are well loved and respected. But at the same time, those parents do a nice job setting limits with those kids and having high expectations. The book, Gentle Parenting Reimagined, I wrote it because these are the families that I work with and the kids that I work with and always have. I've been a child and family psychologist now for about 40 years. And I work with nothing but hard kids, and I have my entire career. And the parents who sit in front of me, they've got difficult kids. They're more difficult than the average kid coming into the world. And so the techniques and strategies that are outlined in my book, I think of them as battle tested, meaning I've used them so many times with so many kids, I know that they work. And so the book is full of strategies that can help parents whose kids are more challenging, kids who tell them no all the time and can be disrespectful, or sometimes even those kids will become physically aggressive or throw huge temper tantrums. And so that's the idea behind the book: is how do you be gentle, which I think is great. I think every parent likes the idea of being gentle. How do you do that? But at the same time, how do you raise these difficult to parent kids in a way that is good for them and good for the rest of the family?
Well, imagine these kids by the time they get to you are pretty defiant. Parents are sort of at the end of their rope, I would assume, because finally, when you get to a psychologist to help mitigate some of these problems, you've really had it.
Well,
Yeah,
certainly. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. That's true. And the ones that I see in my office, these are really, really, really difficult kids. And many of them have already received all kinds of therapy in various different forms, haven't gotten any better. Almost all of them are on medication. So that's true. But there are many, many parents out there who have kids that are difficult, not as necessarily as difficult as the ones that I work with. I'm on a Facebook group, for example, of parents with oppositional kids, and there are 38,000 members on there, I think. So I know a lot of your listeners probably have one of these kids because, as I said, they're just, it's so common.
Well, is it common? Can we sort of, I think you also talk about this, there's the authoritarian, the silent generation who raised kids, kids should be seen and not heard. And well, that's quite a while. That's actually, what, 60, let's say 60 years ago. Then my generation, the baby boomers raising our kids, I think in a permissive, much more permissive. And you use that word too. And then that those kids, as I see them, really have difficulty, I think, when raising their children of not becoming helicopter parents. They're sort of always hovering around their kids, not giving them an opportunity to be independent, that kind of stuff, which isn't really good for the kid or the parent or the relationship or their ability to communicate with each other.
Oh, no, I completely agree. So, current parents, these would be millennials and some of
Gen
the older,
X's, some of them, yeah.
yeah, and some of the older Gen Zs. It is a very different way of raising kids. And, we're in the middle of a mental health epidemic, as I think everybody knows. And one of the contributors to that epidemic is the fact that kids are, this generation of kids has never been safer and better protected. But so many kids now are becoming depressed and anxious, and speculation is that they're just not growing up in environments where people are asking them to be as independent as previous generations. So teenagers these days, far fewer of them have part-time jobs. Kids are delaying getting their driver's license, and parents, they're very well intended and they're loving, but they can be hovering at the same
Yeah.
time. They can just be constantly in the kids' business. I've been to birthday parties where the parents never leave the room, and or the kids have no time just to play and to have fun with each other without having some adult in the room. And again, that's a good thing fundamentally. But when you don't ask kids to do hard things, or you have fewer expectations of them growing up and becoming independent, that is one of the contributors to why so many kids currently are so anxious.
Yeah, and what about, let's talk about boundaries. I think you alluded to that, but being able to establish boundaries with your kids. I think sometimes these parents are afraid of their kids, afraid to set boundaries, afraid to say no. And that obviously is not healthy or good for the kids and or the parents as well.
It's true. So here's what I've learned about kids. All kids want and need limits. They need to know what's okay and what isn't. And obviously, it's a parent's job to be able to set those limits with kids. And I do think you're right. There's less limit setting going on. And I have worked with plenty of parents who are scared of their kids, but sometimes they have reason to be, right? So if you try to set a limit and, oh, I don't know, ask a kid to put their phone down and do anything other than being on their phone, lots of the kids that I work with will yell at their parents, curse at their parents. Some of them will do bigger things than that. I work with plenty of kids who threaten to commit suicide if somebody asks them to get off of a screen. But kids still need to be told no. And when those limits are in place and they're firm and they're consistent, balanced, of course, with parents being loving and kind and all those things, that's where kids thrive. So if you're trying to raise a young human being and for whatever reason you're not good at saying no, and enforcing those limits, it's not enough to tell a teenager to spend less time on their phone. Well, what if they don't spend less time on their phone? How do you get them off? You have to know how to be able to ensure that the limits that you've set in your family are being followed. And the book is about limit setting. It's just all about that stuff. And but if you shy away from doing those things, that's not good, because kids grow up in those environments feeling like they're in charge of their parents. And that is absolutely not a spot any parent would want to find themselves in.
All right, so let's take from your toolbox. What do we do? What are some of these effective methods? What can parents do to enforce the limit setting and setting boundaries and following through? I think that's what you're saying. You have to follow through. You just can't say it and then a half an hour later give up and don't follow through with what you've asked them to do. So let's take some of those access, I guess, from your toolbox. What do? You got the kid in there. Let's take the ones who come into your office who are really defiant, maybe, as you say, even physically defiant. Give us an example.
Sure.
How do you handle it?
It's a great question. I love I do interviews too. I really try to give listeners as many concrete, practical tips as I can during the interview. So let me just give one here that I think would be helpful for most. So first of all, obviously, it's not okay for kids to curse at their parents or yell at them or say mean things or become disrespectful. So it starts with, we don't talk to each other in our family like that, and it is not okay the way you're talking to me right now. So either dial that back and try again, please, but in a nicer way. Um, Otherwise, things are going to happen probably that you don't care for very much. So say a kid is being massively disrespectful and you ask them to say it in a different way and they don't, the easiest intervention and the one that is most potent is to simply say to them, okay, I'd like you please to put your phone up on the kitchen counter and it's going to stay there until you've been nice to me for a while, right? So in order to get their privileges, the things that they want to do, and for most kids, it's some form of an electronic device. Sometimes you can leverage time with friends, although again, this generation, they don't spend nearly as much face time with their friends as previous generations did. But your phone goes up on the counter until you've been nice. So kid has to be respectful again. They have to treat you in a kind or at least a neutral way. How long does a phone need to stay up on the kitchen counter? Well, it kind of depends. It depends. If it's a small transgression, maybe they barked at you or something like that, not the end of the world, I'd probably ask them to put it up on the counter for an hour or two. And again, during the hour or two, I expect the positive behavior out of them. But let's say it's something really big, like they've been physically aggressive or just cursed you out or something like that, that phone's going to stay on the counter for longer. It's going to take the kid more time engaging in the positive behavior before they earn their phone back. And I never tell kids how long. So the biggest mistake I see parents make is you've lost your phone for a week for cursing at me. That is a very common consequence, and it's terrible for many, many different reasons I talk about in the book. So I never give a kid a timeline. It's up on the counter until you earn it back. And every kid says, well, how long is that? And I said, well, honestly, I don't know. It really all depends on you. You could get started right now by being nice and obviously accepting the consequences, a step in the right direction. Or let's just say you don't like this very much and you think I'm being mean and unfair. Fair enough. But you don't earn it back until you do the things that I want you to do. And if you want to be mad for a while, even a few days, that's fine with me. But then you can start to earn it back. So by not giving a timeline, it gives you a lot of flexibility. And I also think it keeps the kid a little bit off balance. Because if you say you've lost your phone for the day, well, most kids can white knuckle it for a day. They're just waiting and waiting to get their phone back. But no, there's no timeline associated with this. And I find that works an awful lot better.
Yeah, and as an observer, I see that parents do, unfortunately, the opposite of what you're telling them to do.
Yes.
Giving them a time. Tonight you can't use your phone, or tomorrow, or one day, or whatever it is, and that's absolutely, don't do that. Good. Yeah. Okay. What about you talk about using questions rather than commands? What does that mean, and how does that work with
Well, this
defiant
concept,
kids? Yeah.
yes, thank you. This ties into the part of the book that it talks about ask versus command. And so I'll just give you a quick overview of that. So when a kid is little, say you have a 5-year-old, you can be very direct in your language with them. It almost sounds like an order. It's not intended to be, but it sounds that way. So you could say to a 5-year-old, hey, it's time for bed. Please go down to your room, get your pajamas on, brush your teeth, and then I'll come read you a story. It's extremely direct. And 5-year-olds take that just fine. Okay, or most of them do anyway. But as kids get older being 9, 10, 11, and beyond, they're very sensitive to how orders or asks are being made of them. It's a very subtle shift in the language, but it works quite well. So instead of saying, say, to a 13 or 14-year-old, get started emptying the dishwasher now, that sounds like an order, right? So you just rephrase it in a way that is a little bit more respectful. It's, hey, I love it somewhere in the next 5 or 10 minutes. If you could please get started on that dishwasher. Thanks for taking care of that. It's really how adults talk to each other. And sometimes parents are slow to make that transition from giving orders to making asks. And let's be honest, when I say to a kid, hey, I'd love it sometime in the next 5 minutes if you could get started emptying that dishwasher, I'm still telling them what to do, but I'm just phrasing in a way that sounds more respectful. So, and again, adults talk to each other that way. If my wife is in the kitchen and I'm watching TV, I don't say to her, bring me a drink now. She's just not going to respond very well to that.
She's going to say, get your own drink.
Exactly. But what I will say to her is, hey, while you're up, would you mind bringing me a drink
Yeah.
when you come back. My wife and probably everybody else is going to go, okay. And kids are the same way. So you can order them around. If you want them to do something, yes, you can ask them to do whatever they want, but try to phrase it as an ask rather than an order, because it decreases the likelihood they'll respond in an oppositional way to you.
So should you be doing this, as I hear you saying, around puberty, let's say 12 or 13 years old? And can you say, could you please help me with whatever you need helping? Could you please help me unload the dishwasher?
Yes, and please is always the way to go. Again, that's what polite people say to each other is, could you please? So here's where sometimes people will run into trouble. So if you say, hey, would you please help me unload the dishwasher? I need it empty because I have to do a bunch of dishes and stuff. I always thank the kid in advance. Thanks for doing that, or thanks for helping. It's a weird thing when you thank somebody before they've actually done something. I believe it increases the likelihood of them doing the thing for you. So I always thank them in advance. Now, what if they say, I'm too busy. I got stuff to do. Do it yourself, or it's not my chore. I did it yesterday. Now we're back to making sure that limits are followed. And how do you do that? I could use the device example again, and I could say, well, look, I don't want to fight with you about this, but the dishwasher needs to be emptied. So either please help me out with this, or you're off your screens until you do. I don't want to fight about this, right? But that's exactly what I'm going to do. If you can't just in an agreeable way help me empty the dishwasher, I'm not asking for the moon. I'm not making you go out to the back 40 and plow the fields. I just want you to empty the dishwasher. So again, it's not okay for kids to tell their parents no. They do that a lot, obviously, but it's not okay for them to do. So you have to have a strategy or a response or an intervention to make sure that they do it. And leveraging privileges, as I said earlier, is really the most effective thing you possibly can do.
Let's take that conversation though, and how it starts to perhaps get into another area of communication. Okay, you sort of started to touch on this, but you're telling the kid, could you please help me unload the dishwasher? And he or she says, I have a big test tomorrow, Mom. I've got a test. I want to get an A on the test. I have to study. I don't have that much time. So I really need to do that first because that's more important than doing the dishwasher thing.
Yeah, so everything you just said in that example that the kid said is what I call a red herring. A red herring is something a kid will say to get them out of the thing that's being asked or to knock their parents off course in the conversation. So, I'd love it if you could empty the dishwasher. Oh, I have a test that I have to study for tomorrow. The mistake that parents make, it's a natural thing to do, is they respond to the red herring. Well, it won't take you very long to empty the dishwasher. Well, I already did other chores today. Why do I have to do more? And the parent will respond to that. Well, I don't ask you to do too much around the house. I don't think one more thing is a big deal. Well, it is a big deal, particularly, I'm on the soccer team and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. So everything the kid said is a red herring. Red herrings are fun because once you see them and you know what they are, you cannot ever unsee them again. So when the kid says, well, I don't have time to do it, I have to study for my test tomorrow, clearly that's a red herring. And kids are very creative with their
Yeah.
red herrings. And sometimes they're nonstop. They'll throw 10 of you at once. But the thing to do is never respond to the red herring itself. So I can't do it. I have other things I need to do. You don't have to respond to that. But words like nonetheless, regardless, in any case, my favorite is be that as it may. Those words all basically mean the same thing. So if a kid's, I can't empty the dishwasher because I have too much else to do, well, nonetheless, the dishwasher still needs to be emptied. Well, that's not fair. Why don't you ask my brother to do it? Well, be that as it may, I need you to empty that dishwasher, please. So those words are great because it sidesteps the entire nonsense argument that kids throw at you. They're definitely red herrings. I find them highly entertaining. And every so often I will bite on one for fun, right? So if he says, well, I can't empty the dishwasher today. I've got soccer practice in an hour. Well, not sure it takes an hour to empty the dishwasher. Well, I suppose if you were like the slowest dishwasher emptier on the entire planet, it might take you the full hour. But I'd be willing to bet most people can empty a dishwasher somewhere in the 5 to 7 minute territory. So is it really true you don't have time? Because it's fun to do. But if you've got a kid that gets mad when you do that to them, then you go right back to, well, look, I'm not going to fight with you. The dishwasher needs to be emptied now, please.
Yeah. So you don't want to get into a debate, and it's so easy to do that. And as you escalate the debate, then you get you start to you talk about yelling, don't yell, but your voice gets a little bit louder, and you have to step back, I guess is what you're saying, and say, okay, this is a red herring. I'm not going to start yelling. I'm not going to start getting angry. Let's keep to what I'm asking him or her to do, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, that
Well, I
no,
don't.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I don't think there's ever a reason to raise your voice with kids. And I know people think that's sometimes crazy when they hear it for the very first time, but I believe it's entirely possible. It takes a little bit of practice, and obviously it takes commitment to the idea. But I've worked with kids for such a long time. What I've learned about them is if a parent starts raising their voice, that's an invitation for the kid to raise their voice too. I also think you lose some of your moral authority with kids when you start yelling because you don't want them to yell at you. You got to lead by example. And I also think parents look the most powerful when they never raise their voice. When no matter what the situation is, they look calm and relaxed and matter of fact. You can be firm, right? But that's not yelling. Firm is I'm not going to argue with you about the dishwasher, or I'm not going to fight with you about your homework. It needs to be done. I didn't raise my voice when I said that, but I do sound like I'm serious about it. So the best thing you can do is not raise your voice. It incentivizes kids to yell at you. And parents don't lead by yelling. No, nobody starts off yelling at their kids. They yell because they've asked the kid 10 times to do something and they're still not doing it. That's when they yell, right? Out of frustration or irritation. But there are a million ways to get kids to do exactly what you want them to do with only one request, maybe sometimes a second prompt. And again, for the parents of hard kids listening to this, they go, that's not my kid. Well, it is actually.
Yeah.
You want them to listen to your reasonable voice and you want them to follow directions the first time you ask them to. You just have to be able to figure out, and I'm happy to teach it to you. You have to know how to get them to do those things by following strategies that are highly effective and letting go of some of the strategies probably that you're using right now that simply don't work.
And as I forgot, you are a clinical psychologist, and that's part of your credits, but also I didn't mention this, and I think I should, that you're a father of four. So
Yeah, I have four
yeah,
daughters exactly,
four
but
daughters.
four daughters. Yeah, they range from youngest is 20 and the oldest now is 30. But I have to confess, I had the easiest kids on the planet. I was just blessed with four easy to parent girls. And there were some things obviously along the way that we had to deal with, but they're just easy kids. And some parents have nothing but easy kids, but many kids aren't. So yeah, it was smooth sailing with my daughters. I kind of joke sometimes that my girls were hopelessly outgunned because no way they're going to get away with anything. So, but like I said, the book is written not about those kids. It's about the ones that just biologically or temperamentally are much more difficult to parent.
And do you think it's more difficult for parents who perhaps they have three or four kids? The first kid is really easy, as you're describing your daughters, but the second kid isn't. But just, personalities, whatever the reasons, and that their expectations are different because they had this first kid who was like very easy, and the second one not so easy, and they haven't developed maybe the skills, or their expectations, as I said, are different for this kid, and it doesn't work as well.
It's true, kids who are easy to parent, that is within the wheelhouse of the vast majority of parents, right? It's kind of easy to figure out what to do that works with them. But the harder to parent kids, that's not within most parents' skill set. They've never been taught it. They've never come across it. What they did with the easy kid is not going to work with what they have to do with the harder kid. And it doesn't mean with harder kids you're mean or harsh with them. Not at all. You're still loving and kind and gentle. But it's just kind of a different way of making sure that your house is not a war zone every single day.
Yeah, not a war zone. That's a good term. I like that. And many parents, as you say, are struggling in a war zone. We only have about 3 minutes left, but I do want to ask you this last question. Negative reinforcement. What is that? What's negative reinforcement as opposed to positive reinforcement? What's the difference?
Well, most people get positive reinforcement. That's when the kid does something that you like and you respond by doing something that they like, right? It could be as simple as, hey, I love how you just took care of that right now. Thank you for doing that. That's simple praise or positive reinforcement. Lots of parents, particularly with younger kids, they use sticker charts and stamps and all those kinds of things. I've never been a big fan of. I think they're too complicated. I don't think they work very well. But that's, positive reinforcement. That's something most people get. Negative reinforcement, oh, it's such a terrible name and nobody really knows what it is. And so I've simplified it. I've rebranded it. Actually, ChatGPT helped me rebrand it. It came up with pause, earn, and return reinforcement, which I think is a term most parents can easily remember, and it kind of makes some sense. So the kid who is being disrespectful, the pause is your phone is now up on the kitchen counter. The kid has to earn it back through positive behavior, and then it's returned. That is technically, in the language of psychology, negative reinforcement. But as I said, I don't like that name because it's just super confusing. That's pause, earn, and return reinforcement. So much easier to remember, but it's basically the same strategy.
All right. Well, we got to read. I obviously recommend the book to my audiences. Read the book. We've just touched on just a few topics that are in the book. So, Paul, I'm talking to psychologist Paul Sunseri, and his book is Gentle Parenting Reimagined: How to Make It Work with Oppositional and Defiant Kids. Um, Lots to talk about. Give us a website and/or websites to go to for more information about you.
You
Where
bet.
we,
So I'm
yeah.
super easy to find. If
Okay.
folks just Google my last name, you'll find me easily. But my website, you had mentioned intensive family focused therapy. That's the easiest way to find me. So it's MyiFFT.org. And again, IFFT stands for intensive family focused therapy. That's the easiest way to find almost everything that I do.
Okay, great. And our audience can listen to us on YouTube. And yeah, get in touch with Paul. Thank you so much for being on the show today. Great talking to you.
Thank you, Kathryn. It was a
Yeah.
great pleasure.
Joining me today is author Marc Kielburger. His new book is What is My Legacy? Realizing a New Dream of Connection, Love, and Fulfillment. From time to time, he was born, Martin Luther King III has carried the weight of his father's legacy and his dream of a beloved community built on justice, love, and equal rights for all. Today, in a world burdened by histories of violence, oppression, racism, poverty, fear, and disconnectedness, that dream seems more remote than ever. Martin has teamed up with his wife and fellow activist, Arndrea Waters King, and legacy architects Marc Kielburger and Craig Kielburger to find a new way forward. Drawing on breakthroughs in neuroscience, psychology, epigenetics, and their own lived experiences, they have created a groundbreaking new framework called Living Legacy. It's based on the simple but profound recognition that our small day-to-day actions create legacies that have the power to transform, uplift, and unite us all. Marc is a New York Times bestselling author, Harvard graduate, Rhodes Scholar, Oxford-trained lawyer, and with 30 years as a movement builder and social entrepreneur, he's collaborated with leaders like Oprah Winfrey and brands like Virgin Group. Welcome to the show, Marc. Nice to have you on.
Thank you for your time.
All right, so we're going to be talking about your new book, What is My Legacy? You have so What is My Legacy has to do with, you've created this groundbreaking new framework, as I just mentioned, called Living Legacy. So let's talk about what is Living Legacy and how does this living legacy, I'm curious, fit into the context of our most recent presidential election?
Well, two very important questions. So let me start
Okay.
with the easy one first in terms of living legacy. So the whole concept of what we did in this book is redefine the concept of legacy. Specifically, legacy typically right now is what happens in the latter years of one's life. Typically, it's seen in not all the time, but as individuals have amassed some degree of personal wealth and they then want to leave a legacy and they want to endow something or they want to make a donation or whatever that might be. And that's something that we have looked at carefully in this book and said that's actually not what legacy is about. What legacy is truly about is not what happens at the end of your life, whether you have resources or not. Legacy in our mind is actually how you live your life every single day. And we've come up with this concept that you lovingly shared, but we believe is something called a living legacy. And the living legacy concept is how you live your life on a daily basis. So what we're seeking to do as part of this initiative is help people shift their mindset to move from legacy as something that happens later to something that happens every day. It's who you are, what you become, how you make decisions, how you filter the daily opportunities that are presented to you, and candidly, how you create a life that's truly worth living. In terms of how this relates to the presidential election slash inauguration, obviously a much more complicated subject. We see the concept of living legacy as something that has a multitude of different generations. In First Nations philosophy and culture, it's often about 7 generations. And so what they do is they look 7 generations ahead to make decisions now that impact the next 7 generations. Is something that we talk about in the book, and we've spent a lot of time with First Nations individuals and Indigenous peoples around the world, including in North America, and that's something that inspires us. My concern of what's happening right now is politics, not just in the United States, but places in Canada and the UK and others, has to be really focused on short-term thinking and short-termism, if that's even a word, as opposed to looking multitude of generations ahead and what are the decisions and the impact of those decisions have on those multitude of generations. Because when we think of legacy, it's not just our legacy, it's the legacy of our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids perhaps yet to be born. And looking at that from that prism or that lens is so important when making decisions for today.
So how do we get people to buy into that? Because as you said in the beginning, legacy, most people think of legacy as what you leave behind, as opposed to what you do every day and the impact that has on our culture, our communities, our environment. So obviously they read your book, but where do they have to be emotionally to kind of hone in and accept what you're saying?
Well, we spent years working on this book, and our co-authors, Martin Luther King III and Arndrea Waters King, and my brother Craig Kielburger. You look at Martin, for example, he's the son of Dr. King, a person who grew up in tremendous trauma. I mean, obviously, we all know that his father was shot and killed when he was 10. What people may not know is that his grandmother was also assassinated and shot and killed when she was praying the Lord's Prayer in church a handful of years after, and she was assassinated. They were actually looking. The assassin was trying to kill Martin's grandfather, couldn't find him, and ended up killing Martin's grandmother instead. And then a few short years after that, his uncle, who was a very good swimmer, died in mysterious circumstances in a swimming accident. And so, he's gone through a lot of trauma in his life. And the reality is that perhaps not all of us have gone to that extent of trauma, but trauma is something that we now all carry. One of the things that we talk about in the book is something called epigenetics. It's a new area of science that actually shows that trauma and traumatic events can actually be passed down from generation to generation. And happy to talk more about that if that's of interest, but it's something that's just fascinating to see. So if
No, that is of interest, the intergenerational trauma. And I guess part of that is either it's in the trauma that could have been 1, 2, 3 generations away, and you can talk more about this, has to do, it can be in your DNA or how you were raised or both.
Yeah, no, Kathryn, you're very wise. That's 100% correct, and I'm glad you shared that because I hope your listeners can consider what are those traumas not only that they went through from their own life, but what were those traumas that were passed on to them. And so for Martin, a lot of trauma and was passed on to him for obvious reasons, and also the trauma of slavery and the trauma of many other issues that were impacted that community. And the reason we share this, and you asked the question, well, how does one buy into this? The reality is that a couple of years ago, the word of the year in the Oxford English Dictionary was permacrisis, which basically means that we're in a state of constant crisis, environmental crisis, mental health crisis, food security crisis, financial crisis, like we're living in a state of crisis. And the current structure of how we're approaching these issues is causing, issues around depression, mental health challenges. Suicide ideation is now one of the leading causes of young people in terms of passing and death. Like our current way of addressing all these issues, candidly, is not working. And so what we looked at a lot of research and talked to a lot of experts is that we need to come up with an alternative. And, is this the answer to everything? Of course not. Is this a step forward in the right direction? We truly believe so.
Okay, and now put it in the context of like this present administration, okay, in our country. How does this fit into what we have to do and how we have to do it? I mean, you talk about trauma, we have, and you mentioned a lot of things. We have drugs and climate change and all of those kinds of things. So how do we operate in this political system?
Well, I mean, I think we can all agree that the political system, quite frankly, is not functioning in a coherent and structured way. And so the objective here with the Kings and the work that we're doing, candidly, is actually working outside the political system because we think the political system has become so dysfunctional. And so what we've done through this initiative is gone back to the core of what Dr. King was talking about. And before he was shot and killed, he spoke very eloquently about a really important concept that one can be seen as, a societal concept, but can also be equally applied to a political concept. And it was something called the beloved community. And Dr. King spoke really passionately and very eloquently about this idea. It was one perhaps could see it was a utopian idea, but nevertheless one that he really believed in. And I have a lot of time for Dr. King's work and philosophy and actions and passion for obvious reasons. But his concept of the beloved community was one that we're all connected and interconnected, one that we all have an opportunity to work together as one community globally, one community locally, one community, in our streets, in our regions, and where we work. And the problem in so much is that we've become so disconnected. And because we've become so disconnected, partially because of politics and partially because of economics and all these things, that's where, anger and resentment come from. But Dr. King was talking about something very different to again, this concept of love community. And some may not realize, but actually Dr. King's 100th birthday of his birth is coming up in 4 years from now. So Dr. King, if he hadn't been assassinated and if he had still be alive, he'd be turning 100. And so what Martin Luther King III and Arndrea Waters King are doing as part of this book and this philosophy with us is to bring back this concept of the beloved community and to actually create the connection and interconnection, dependence and interdependence that Dr. King was talking about. And in 4 years from now, the call to action is not a political one, it's actually one about service. So the idea is to do 100 million hours of service for the 100th anniversary of Dr. King's birth. And so this initiative has been kicked off with partnerships, from sports leagues to the NFL to the NBA to many others who have stepped in to be of assistance here and to do a rallying cry, in this case in a non-political structure, but to bring people together. And I think that's what's really badly broken here is that, if nothing else, the current politics shows us is that we're more divided than ever. And one way of actually bringing us back together is through service.
Yeah, and I was talking to a friend of mine who she said, well, I only hang out with like-minded people. And I said to her, well, wouldn't it be more helpful in terms of connecting to the community if you hung out with people who weren't like-minded? And that would be very different than just hanging out in your own group, which is what we seem to be doing, right?
And Kathryn, to that point, one of the ways to hang out with people perhaps that have different political views is in a non-political environment is through service. And whether you're serving your local humane society or doing amazing work with providing meals to underprivileged people or perhaps the elderly in your community or helping students who otherwise need additional support with the tutoring, whatever that is. It doesn't matter to me. It's whatever passion you care about. You can do that with people of all political stripes because you're coming together to serve not for whether it be one's views of being red state or blue state or anywhere between, is because just we want to serve. And we become so divided and so candidly the political system becomes so dysfunctional that we need to kind of recreate the table stakes, if you will, recreate the lowest common denominator, putting people back in the same room and engaging. And one of the most loving, engaging, passionate ways that one can do that is by just serving. And you can do that with people from all political views.
And don't you give examples in the book that the specific examples of people who do that and who have or are doing that, people that we know about, well-known people?
We have so many amazing individuals who have contributed to the book, icons like Dan Rather or Simon Sinek. We have individuals like Russell Wilson and Ciara, his amazing wife. We have people like Melinda French Gates and many others. People who live and embody this, and they truly believe in this concept of living legacy. Again, how you can live your legacy every single day. They truly believe in the concept of service. And you can serve your community, you can serve your country, you can just serve, but the service is so important. And they truly believe in the fact that enough yelling on both sides of the aisle. Let's actually come and actually do something that's actually beneficial. When I had the privilege of going to Harvard on scholarship, and I came from modest backgrounds, both my parents were teachers, but nevertheless, I learned from an amazing professor named Robert Putnam. He wrote a seminal book in the year 2000 called Bowling Alone. And this book speaks about the fact that there's a decline in American connectivity and connectedness. And he uses this example in terms of the decline in bowling leagues. There's an esoteric example. It's just an interesting title, nevertheless. But with commute time and with economic challenges and many people having to work, 1 plus 1.5 plus 2 jobs, whatever it is, we don't have time for community anymore. We've lost our community social connection. And the fact that if we can recreate that connection, this is one of the most important things we can do. Vivek Murthy, who just left the former administration, he was America's top doctor, of course, and he called the fact that America was facing a national epidemic on the issue of loneliness. And he basically showed through his research that if one is lonely, again, I'm going to say this one more time, if one is lonely, it's the equivalent of smoking 2 packs a day of cigarettes for one's health. So if one is lonely and don't have that social safety net, that have that social sense of community, don't have, a friend or a loving group around you, the research shows that one lives on average 7 to 9 years less, so fewer years than if somebody actually had that. So getting involved, getting connected, getting engaged, serving, creating a living legacy, candidly, is not just good for the country, it's not just good for your community, it's not just good for the people who you will be helping. It's essential for you. That you will live a happier, more productive, and candidly a longer life. And this is some critical research that's also outlined in the book, but it's been very definitively proven through science.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you talk about women live, you said 7 to 8 years. Women live 7 to 8 years longer than men, and I think they have a natural ability to communicate and connect. Maybe because in raising children, or for whatever whatever the reasons are, and social reasons as well. So, yeah, and they do live longer, and I think that that kind of uh, ability to do that, as you're describing it, um, is true. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, I
Yeah,
guess.
Kathryn, I'm just going to jump in on that one. I
Yeah.
really am glad that you mentioned that, because part of the research also shows that one of the reasons women do live longer is exactly what you shared. I'm just going to extrapolate for a moment, is because there's genetic and DNA issues, of course, but more importantly, in this conversation, they have that sense of community. They have, the girlfriends, they have the ability to engage more significantly in the community. Perhaps they might have a different type of job that allows them to do so, whatever the circumstances. But the point being is the research equal shows that men, and especially white American men, are so lonely. And the research, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something worth looking up on the internet and just finding a reputable source. But I'm going to paraphrase for a moment. But the number of men that actually can't say that they have a good friend or a best friend, or don't have more than 3 friends, is the majority. And the point being is that American men feel more disconnected than ever because they don't have that sense of friendship, a true, real friends. I mean, they might have friends, but true, real friends that they actually know will be there for them, will actually help them in a time of need, will be there for them in a time of crisis. We're not talking certainly about friends on social media or these fake friends that like our posts. We're talking about something much more substantive. Equally, the research shows that we have a biological need for connection. There's this amazing theory, if anybody wants to look it up, it's called the polyvagal theory. And it really shows that part of our DNA, we are wired to need connection as part of our nervous system. If we don't have meaningful connections with other people in their lives, our nervous system actually doesn't regulate in the best possible way and actually causes a whole bunch of additional health issues. So we have a biological need for connection. By definition, we're pack animals. Like, that's essentially where we evolved from. And so the more we can create connection, again, through service, but other mechanisms, helps us, again, live longer, happier, healthier lives, but is something we need as individuals. And again, Vivek Murthy's research shows, and a lot of research shows, that we're headed in the wrong direction on these very important topics.
So how do we kind of reverse that? Or not kind of, how do we reverse that if we're going in the wrong direction? I mean, we have this biological imperative, you say. Don't we have to start with raising our kids, but take a look at how we're raising our the boys.
Especially raising boys, yes,
Yeah.
and raising kids. I mean, I've got 2 girls, and it's interesting the number of social media executives that we speak to in the Valley who don't let their own kids use social media. I'm just going to put that aside. So it's just an interesting thing how social media also creates disconnection and so many challenges as well. And my kids do use social media, on the evenings, and they want to watch their YouTube and so forth as well. But that, creates challenges and opportunities for parents as well. So, looking at these opportunities to say, how can we use social media to create educational opportunities in a robust way about these issues, about how do we connect, about opportunities. Like my kids, for example, I've got 2 girls, they love animals. They will help any animal out at any point. And how do we use the internet or social media to be more connected in our community to help animals? And so we go volunteer at our local animal shelter, for example. But the point being, you asked a really important question, Kathryn. What do we do? Well, the first thing is we need to make a decision, because the current structure of how we're spending our time and our resources, and this rat race that we tend to all be on, is not headed in the right direction. We've been, in my opinion, sold a wrong bill of goods. We think that by working harder, moving up the corporate ladder, having a bigger house, a bigger car is ultimately going to find us happiness. And all the research shows that it actually doesn't. It actually makes us more unhappy. And I'm happy to explain the science behind that between dopamine and serotonin levels in your brain. But the reason being is I would encourage your listeners, and I had to do this my own self, is asking some fundamental questions. What's most important to you? And what's really most important to you? Why do you really get out of bed in the morning? Like, what is, if today was your last day, would you judge your life a success? And what does that success mean to you? And I remember Pastor Rick Warren, gave this incredible commencement address. And he was talking to the students and he said something, and I'm paraphrasing, but I've been with so many people, he said, on their last days, because as a pastor, that's part of his job and role is to help people transition. And he said, every single person has the same response. They don't call in and say, bring me my, photo of my accolades. They don't call in and say, bring me the award I won, for my corp company. They don't call in and say, bring me all my degrees so I can have those degrees around me and around my hospital bed as I transition or as I pass. They say, bring me the people I love the most. Bring me the people I need to say sorry to. Bring me the people who have meant most to me in my life. And I think those words, again, paraphrased, albeit, can inspire us to ask us those fundamental questions. What is actually most important to us? And once we are really clear on that, then how do we create a plan and daily activities and initiatives that allow us to get to that outcome? When I was young, I was mentored by an amazing gentleman. His name was Stephen Covey. He wrote a seminal book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Some of your readers, I'm sure, listeners, I'm sure, have read this. But one of the 7 habits that he talks about is to begin with the end in mind. I'm going to say that one more time, to begin with the end in mind. So when people have the opportunity to truly realize what is most important to them and where they want to be on those final days, because we're all going to be there at one day. We don't want to think about it, but it's all going to happen. What's going to be most important? And am I living a life candidly every day to allow me to have that outcome that I'm seeking? And that's the big question I think we all need to ask.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of the word balance too. There has to be a balance. It's not that you're giving up perhaps accomplishing certain things or whatever, everybody's different, or being a professional, whatever you want to do, or living a certain lifestyle. You need to balance that with also what you've been talking about, the connectedness, love, family, friends, all of those things. It's not all or nothing.
Absolutely, Kathryn. I want to underscore what you said because it's so, so important. The research shows that once you've tapped out at about $70,000 to $80,000 a year, and that might just be for an individual, not a family of 4, in fairness, any additional amounts on top of that, your happiness goes up only so incrementally. So once your basic needs are met and you have enough, and you've got your food covered and you've got your transportation covered and you've got a warm house over your head and so forth as well, the more you increase, the research is definitive on this, and the more you accumulate, your happiness only goes up in a very small amount in terms of proportionality to that. And so I just encourage people to think, again, what's most important to them. And of course, having those fundamentals are absolutely critical. Having balance in that approach is absolutely critical. But what tends to happen is that we ended up in this, commercial rat race. And we end up saying, when I retire, I will focus on my family. When I retire, I will focus on my health. When I have more time, I will undertake personal opportunities for growth and transformation, or whatever that is. And we put those things aside, thinking that that's going to be, my strategy after. When in reality, we spend so many years going down a certain path and then looking back and having regrets. And those regrets can be substantive. And so we just want to encourage people to have those big decisions and conversations now. And the book talks about the science and the epidemiology around this and the scientific basis around this and all the aspects around this and what this looks like, and actually how to look this from a neuroscience perspective, from a practical perspective, from a faith perspective, from a spiritual perspective, on how to do this in a very practical way through this concept called living legacy.
Living legacy. What is my legacy? That's the title of the book, Realizing a New Dream of Connection, Love, and Fulfillment. And I've been talking to the author, Marc Kielburger. Fascinating book. We all need to read it. Give us website and or platforms we can go to for more information about the book and about the work that you're doing?
You're very kind. If you go to mylegacy.com, so mylegacy.com, people can find more information of the book, or on social, especially on Instagram, My Legacy Movement, all one word, My Legacy Movement, for daily doses of inspiration and practical how-to tips on how to do so.
Great. Thanks so much for being on the show today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.